Dear listeners, I ask you to listen to the story until the very end and be sure to write a review about what you liked and what needs to be changed to make it more interesting for you to listen to my stories. Shadow in the jungles of Borneo. The first time I saw the jungle of Borneo, I thought it was alive. Not just filled with life, but breathing, watching. The trees, ancient and towering, leaned toward each other like whispering conspirators. The vines twisted around trunks in a slow, patient stranglehold, while the undergrowth pulsed with unseen movement. A place older than war, older than man. But war had found it anyway. Our mission was simple in theory: infiltrate, eliminate, exfiltrate. A Japanese command post deep in the jungle, hidden like a spider in its web, orchestrating ambushes on Allied supply lines. Intelligence was sketchy. There were maps, aerial photos, but the jungle had its own way of swallowing truth. What was marked as a clearing might be a swamp. What looked like a trail could lead to nowhere. The only thing we knew for sure was that they didn't expect us. We were a small unit, 6 men, each carrying more than just gear. Ghosts from past missions, fears that crept in during the silence, the unspoken knowledge that one mistake meant we wouldn't be coming back. I was the point man. That meant my eyes saw first, my hands signaled, my steps decided whether we lived or died. The jungle dictated our speed, and it wasn't generous. Every footstep risked setting off a mine or alerting a patrol. The rain came in waves, soaking our uniforms, making the ground a slick, treacherous mess. But the worst was the silence that followed. One night, as we moved in near total darkness, I felt something watching. Not an animal, not the enemy, something else. The jungle, the weight of it. My breath caught, and for a moment I forgot to move. A vine brushed my face, and I almost opened fire. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Ahead, Lieutenant Carter gave me a sharp look, the kind that meant keep it together. I exhaled and moved forward. By the third day, we were close. Too close. The scent of cigarette smoke drifted through the trees. The Japanese were near, and they had no reason to be quiet. We crouched in the mud, listening. Laughter, the clink of metal on metal, the scrape of boots against wood. They were in a clearing just ahead, their post set up between 2 massive trees, camouflaged beneath layers of netting and leaves. A radio operator sat in the center, headphones on, tapping out messages. We had the element of surprise. But something wasn't right. The jungle, that damn jungle, felt heavier, as if it knew what was coming. Then a snap. A single, terrible crack of a broken twig. Every head in the clearing turned. And the night exploded. Gunfire ripped through the jungle, sharp bursts of light cutting through the darkness. We hit the ground, melting into the mud as bullets tore through leaves and branches. The Japanese soldiers weren't panicking. They reacted fast, too fast. It was like they had been expecting us. Carter barked orders, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Fall back. Flank left. I crawled through the wet earth, my rifle clutched tight, heart hammering. The jungle swallowed sound in strange ways. What seemed close was far. What was behind could be ahead. I spotted movement in the underbrush, a shadow where no shadow should be. My finger tightened on the trigger. Then something cold slithered past my neck. Not a vine, not an animal. It was like the jungle itself had come alive. I rolled, pulling free, just as a bayonet stabbed the earth where my head had been. A Japanese soldier, his face barely visible in the darkness, lunged at me again. I fired twice. He crumpled without a sound. Carter and the others were pushing forward, using the chaos to our advantage. The Japanese weren't prepared for a close-quarters fight in their own camp. A grenade went off to my right, sending a rain of dirt and leaves into the air. We pressed on, clearing the command post one hut at a time. I kicked open a wooden door, finding the radio operator still at his station, his hands frozen over the equipment. He turned, eyes wide. I hesitated. He was just a kid. Then his hand moved too fast, toward the pistol on his belt. I fired. The radio crackled as he slumped forward, blood spreading over the wooden desk. A final message, half sent, still pulsed in Morse code. A call for reinforcements. We needed to go. No. But as I turned, something shifted in the jungle. Not the enemy. Not the wind. Something else. Watching. Waiting. And then, from the darkness, came the whisper of movement. The kind that didn't belong to any man. The jungle had gone still. Not the kind of stillness that came after a firefight, where the echoes of gunfire slowly faded into the damp air, but something deeper, something unnatural. The sounds of insects and distant night birds had vanished, swallowed up by a silence so heavy it felt like the trees were holding their breath. My skin prickled, and I wasn't the only one who noticed it. Carter turned his head sharply, his eyes scanning the blackness beyond the smoldering remains of the Japanese command post. The others were regrouping, checking ammo, wiping sweat and dirt from their faces, but no one spoke. Something about the way the jungle loomed around us made conversation seem like a risk. I crouched near the radio operator's body, my fingers brushing against the blood-slicked wood of the desk as I leaned in to read the last transmission. I barely knew Morse code, but even I could recognize the urgency in those final taps. Reinforcements were already on their way. Maybe an hour, maybe less. We didn't have time to bury our dead, let alone stand around trying to understand why the jungle felt wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had already made a mistake, not just by coming here, not just by leaving our own trail of bodies in the mud, but something worse, something we had disturbed without realizing it. Carter gave the order to move out, and we slipped back into the trees, trying to retrace our steps without leaving any more signs of our presence. It should have been easy. The way we had come was burned into my memory, every branch, every bend in the terrain. But as we moved deeper, things didn't look the same. Paths we had taken before seemed to curve in ways they hadn't before. Landmarks disappeared, swallowed by twisting roots and shifting shadows. The rain started again, a slow, insidious drizzle that made the ground slick beneath our boots. I clenched my teeth, gripping my rifle tighter as my heartbeat picked up. Henderson, the youngest of us, was muttering under his breath. His voice was too low for me to catch the words, but I could hear the unease. He had grown up in Louisiana, in the bayous, where the land could swallow a man whole if he didn't respect it. I had seen him charge into machine gun fire without hesitation, but now his hands were shaking. The jungle was doing something to him. To all of us. Keep moving. Carter's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of command. He wasn't panicking yet. That was good. Then we heard it. A sound from deep in the trees, too far to see, too close to ignore. It wasn't an animal, not the bark of a monkey or the cry of a bird. It was something between a whisper and a breath, something that seemed to crawl through the leaves and coil around our skin. It lasted only a second, but in that second, every one of us froze. Carter gave a sharp hand signal. Move faster. The rain intensified, a steady drumbeat on the leaves above us. My boots sank into the mud, and I fought to keep my balance as we pushed forward. The map said there was a river ahead, a place where we could lose our scent and disappear before the reinforcement arrived. We just had to make it there. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I barely had time to react before I was falling, my body crashing through tangled roots and wet earth. My rifle was ripped from my hands as I hit something hard, my breath torn from my lungs. The world tilted, spinning, as I slid downward into darkness. And when I finally came to a stop, lying on my back in a cavern of twisting vines and damp stone, I realized I wasn't alone. There was something in the darkness with me, and it was breathing. The air down here was thick, too thick. It felt like I was drowning, though there was no water. My lungs refused to fill properly, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd broken something. But then through the ringing in my ears, I heard it again. That breath. Long, slow, deliberate. Something was down here, just beyond the edges of my vision. I forced myself up onto my elbows, ignoring the sharp pain in my side. My rifle was gone, lost somewhere in the fall, but my sidearm was still holstered. I reached for it, fingers shaking as I fumbled with the strap. The darkness in the cavern wasn't absolute. Above me, the jungle canopy barely let in slivers of pale moonlight, casting faint, shifting shadows along the damp stone walls. Vines hung down like grasping fingers, and the air smelled wrong, stale and old, like something that had been sealed away for far too long. The sound behind me, a wet, dragging movement. I turned sharply, gun raised, but there was nothing. Just the darkness, stretching too far for what should have been a shallow sinkhole. My pulse pounded in my ears as I realized the ground beneath me wasn't just rock. It was covered in something soft, something fibrous. My stomach twisted as I reached down, my fingers brushing against what felt like rope? No, not rope. It had give, almost like flesh. My throat tightened. This wasn't just a hole in the earth. It was something else. Something alive. Above me, voices. Carter's voice. The others had reached the edge of the collapse, their flashlight beams cutting jagged lines through the dark. Douglas, you alive down there? I opened my mouth to respond, but then I heard it again. The breathing. Closer this time. Not just one set of lungs. More. I pressed my back against the stone, gun aimed at nothing, trying to slow my breathing. Whatever was down here, it had been waiting. I could feel it now. All around me, in the air, in the walls. Something ancient. Something patient. The Japanese hadn't built their command post near this place by accident. They had known. Or maybe they hadn't. Maybe they had just been unfortunate enough to wake it up. Above, Carter cursed. We're coming down. No. My voice came out hoarse, harsher than I intended. The last thing we needed was more bodies trapped down here. Row? Throw me a damn row. For a moment, silence. Then the scuffle of boots, the sound of gears shifting. I exhaled, trying to focus on the small, tangible things. The weight of my gun, the cold press of stone against my back, the faint trickle of water somewhere deeper in the cavern. If I could just hold on a little longer. A shift. Not in the air. In the ground beneath me. I barely had time to react before something lashed out from the dark, wrapping around my ankle. It was fast, impossibly fast, and it didn't feel like a hand. It was rough, fibrous, like the vines above, but stronger, pulsing with something beneath the surface. I kicked, twisting, firing blindly into the dark. The gunshot roared through the cavern, deafening in the enclosed space. Whatever had grabbed me recoiled, hissing, not in pain, but in something else. Amusement? No, that was impossible. Then the rope dropped, swinging just within reach. I lunged for it, grabbing tight as I felt the ground shift again beneath me. Something pulling, something resisting. Hands above, strong hands, yanked me upward, dragging me from the cavern's maw. I barely cleared the edge before the ground below seemed to cave in further, a deep, gaping void swallowing the space where I had just been. I collapsed onto the jungle floor, gasping. Carter knelt beside me, his eyes scanning my face, then the darkness below. What the hell happened down there? I shook my head, unable to put it into words. I could still feel it, whatever it was, pressing against my mind like an unfinished thought. I had the overwhelming sense that I had been allowed to leave. The jungle around us was silent again. But this time, it wasn't just watching. It was waiting. We didn't stay to find out what the jungle was waiting for. Carter gave the order to move, and we ran, through the vines, through the mud, away from that pit and whatever had been inside it. I could still feel the thing that had grabbed me, its rough, pulsing texture burning against my skin like a memory I couldn't shake. My mind kept trying to rationalize it, to fit it into something explainable. A root, maybe. Some kind of animal. But deep down, I knew. That wasn't an animal. That wasn't a root. The jungle was alive in a way I had never understood before, and we had trespassed into something old, something patient, something that wasn't used to being disturbed. Henderson ran beside me, his breath coming fast and ragged. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by wide, darting eyes that scanned the trees as if expecting something to lunge at us from the dark. Behind us, Parker kept glancing over his shoulder, his rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Even Carter, the man who never let fear show, had an edge to his movements that hadn't been there before. The river was close. I could hear it now, the steady rush of water cutting through the night. We just had to make it there. Wash away our tracks, disappear before the Japanese reinforcements arrived. Then I saw it, just for a second. A figure standing up between the trees. It wasn't one of us. It wasn't one of them. It was tall, too tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted in an unnatural way, like a marionette that had been strung up wrong. I only caught a glimpse before the trees swallowed it again, but that was enough. I nearly stumbled, my breath catching in my throat. My instinct screamed at me to look again, to find it, but I didn't. Because some part of me knew that if I did, if I really saw it, I wouldn't be able to look away. We hit the riverbank, sliding down the embankment into the cold water. It was deeper than I expected, the current stronger, but I welcomed it. The jungle's grip loosened as we waded in. as if the water itself was a barrier it couldn't cross. Carter motioned for silence. We crouched low, letting the river carry us downstream, our bodies half submerged. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy, but I could make out the shapes of the others: Henderson, Parker, two more whose names barely registered through the pounding in my head. I counted them again and again, reassuring myself that we were all still here. Then I saw the footprints. Not ours. On the far bank, in the mud, were deep impressions. Large, spaced too far apart for a normal stride. They led from the trees to the water's edge. And they didn't come back. Something had walked into the river. And it hadn't come out. I clenched my teeth, my fingers tightening around my rifle. I wanted to believe they were old tracks, that they had nothing to do with what I had seen in the trees. But I couldn't. Because the jungle had been watching us since the moment we arrived. And now it was following. Carter tapped my shoulder, motioning downstream. Keep moving. Don't stop. We let the current carry us, drifting further from the command post, further from that hole in the ground, further from whatever had been watching. But the feeling didn't fade. Even as the jungle grew distant behind us, even as the sound of gunfire and voices, Japanese reinforcement arriving too late, faded into the night, I still felt it. That whispering breath. That presence just beyond the edge of sight. Waiting. We made it to the extraction point by dawn, soaked, exhausted, half mad with whatever we had just lived through. The Navy boys didn't ask questions when they pulled us onto the boat. Maybe they saw it in our eyes. Maybe they had their own stories. None of us talked about what happened in that jungle. Not in the debrief. Not in the barracks. Not ever. But even now, all these years later, when I close my eyes, I still see it. The jungle. The pit. That thing in the trees. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I still hear it breathing.